How did Gandhi's personal experiments with food shape his political activism and India's freedom struggle? What connects a young Indian woman, Kamala Devi's act of defiance in segregated America, with the civil rights movement that would follow decades later? And how did freedom fighters in India and black activists in America find common cause in their struggles against oppression? To answer these questions, we have Dr. Nico Slate, professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University, joining us on Adventures of a Bystander. Due to prior commitments, Dr. Slate could only record an audio version of the podcast, but worry not, for the insights are as vibrant and the stories as colorful as ever. So sit back and enjoy as Dr. Slate takes us across oceans and continents, uncovering the remarkable connections between two nations and their people's fights for dignity and justice.
Dr. Slate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Slate, whenever I come across non-Indian academics who are doing some great research on India, I always ask them what was like their earliest memory of interacting with India. It's usually the first time they had Indian food or they had Indian friends. And all of those, has a story of its own to tell. So I would love to start from right there. Like growing up, what is the earliest memory of you interacting with India through its either music or food or whatever? What were those early memories like?
I am so delighted by this question. I've been studying India for many years, but I believe this is the first time someone has posed the question in quite that way. I really appreciate it. I don't have any childhood memories of India. I'm sure at some point I was introduced to various facets of Indian history, like most Americans. I'm sure at some point I learned something about Gandhi. But as you know, most people growing up in the US who are not of Indian descent, even today, but certainly 30, 40 years ago, were not taught very much about India. It's a major failing, I think, in this country's educational system. I don't think I knew much at all until I got to college. And it was really in college that I befriended people who were either directly from India or of Indian descent, started to learn more about the country. And for me, the real turning point came when I was a junior in college and I had the opportunity to go abroad to conduct some research and ended up deciding on going to Nepal. Which shares a lot culturally and historically with India. And when I was in Nepal, I actually crossed the border very briefly into northern India. But I became very interested in South Asia more broadly. And then the following year went back to India directly to Kerala in the south. So I had this sort of interesting introduction first to the very northernmost part of India and then to the very southernmost part. And then since then have developed an interest in many different regions within India and many different facets of Indian history and culture. So for me, it really started in college and has just grown from there.
Right. And although this is very early on in the podcast, but let me throw a rather controversial question right up there. What type of food do you prefer? North Indian food or South Indian food?
Oh, I appreciate that. Is a controversial question. Well, okay. I will start by saying I delight in all foods that come from India. I am not an imperialist, and I am delighted that we live at a time when the empires of the past are no longer with us, at least in their old forms. But I do sometimes wish that Indian food had fully conquered the world, that there was even more of it present. There is, of course, much of it in many places, but it is my favorite cuisine. But of course, it's many cuisines. And I think if the question is north versus south, I might tip towards the north. But if I can disaggregate, I would say still Kerala cuisine. Kerala is the part of India I spent the most time, even to this day. And I think Kerala cuisine is my ultimate favorite overall.
That's fair. I mean, God's own country needs to have great food, and I think
that is, yes, indeed.
So as a junior, you're introduced to India, you visit India as well. When does the interest turn more academic? When do you start understanding that, all right, this is a country, this is a culture which I would want to explore academically on a more serious level?
That did not happen until I was doing my PhD in history. I applied to the PhD program planning to focus entirely on the history of the United States. But in my first semester as a graduate student, I had to write a research paper. And like most graduate students in the first semester, I didn't really have a great idea of what to write on. And somehow into my brain came this little fact that I had gathered earlier, which is that Gandhi had some kind of interaction with the famous African-American scientist, George Washington Carver. And it was just a little fact in my brain. And I thought, I wonder what's been written about that. I wonder what we know about that. And I found that very little had been written, but that I could get all of Carver's papers sent to my university on microfilm, and that much of Gandhi's papers were already gathered and accessible. And so I was able to use these different archival sources to uncover what actually was quite a fascinating interaction. I wouldn't say a relationship, that would go too far. The two men never met in person, but they did correspond, and they had a really remarkable and deep interest in each other's work. And that allowed me to say something about each of those men, but also more broadly about the connections between the Indian freedom struggle and African-American struggles against racism in this country. And that larger question really fascinated me. And so the very next semester, I wrote another paper on that, and it started to snowball, and I ended up switching my doctoral focus from what had originally been planned to be something just looking at the US to what it ultimately became, which was the dissertation, and then became my first book, which looks broadly at connections between African-American and South Asian freedom struggles.
Right. And that book you're mentioning is colored Cosmopolitanism, which a great read. So growing up, I, of course, knew that there is a lot of shared contact between Britain and in India for obvious reasons. But the sort of exchange of ideas between India and America was something which I was not very aware of. So in that sense, your book was also pretty illuminating. Now, since there's so much shared history, as you show, between India and America, of course, you mentioned Gandhi and Carver. When you were doing all of this research and when that book eventually came about, what were your key takeaways as a historian? Like this, did you feel that not enough people knew about this, or were you talking to people who knew that, yes, India and America have had that very fertile exchange of ideas ever since antiquity?
Yes. I had a couple key takeaways at that point that have stayed with me. One is that the history of linkages between the US and India is much broader and deeper than most people recognize. In regards to the specific links to the Black freedom struggle, most of us know a little bit about the influence of Gandhi on Martin Luther King. But in fact, these connections were much broader. They went well beyond Gandhi and King to many other figures within Indian history and many other figures within the African-American freedom struggle. And it wasn't just a question of, oh, there's more people involved, but as you look at how these different people conceived of these linkages, the story becomes so much more complicated and interesting than it's usually portrayed. Usually it's a story about nonviolence. And the idea of Gandhi and nonviolence gets taken up and championed by Martin Luther King. And that story itself is incredibly rich and interesting. But there are many other facets of linkages between these different countries. Look, for example, at the long history of comparisons between race and caste. So you have someone like B.R. Ambedkar writing to the great African-American thinker and activist W.E. Du Bois, and those two men sharing a brief correspondence. There's those linkages. As you know, my most recent book is on Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and Kamaladevi's interest in the U.S. spans a range of movements and goals. So some of it is about gaining American support for Indian independence, but she's also very interested in forging ties with feminists and women who are fighting against sexism in the United States and around the world. She's very interested in supporting Black struggles. That history is deeply important to her. She reaches out to Native American communities. So she's very interested in a range of different connections. And that is part of what I find so important in this story, is that the linkages between the US and India are as multivaried and as rich as the histories of each of those countries themselves.
Right. That is fascinating. And particularly if you mentioned Gandhi, even before talking to Carver, there's been a constant inflow of ideas, especially from, let's say, Thoreau, who Gandhi is reading, and there's a lot of Gandhi's own spirituality and idea around political and social activism, which is coming from a lot of these American intellectuals and American laureates. So you've interacted with so many members of the Indian freedom struggle. They are, for lack of a better word, the founding fathers and mothers of our country. But I was particularly fascinated by your work on Gandhi's diet. Now, I've explored Gandhi through different lenses. Of course, Ram Guha, with whom you've collaborated, has this fascinating 2-volume biography on Gandhi. But I hadn't really read much about Gandhi's diet. And why did you choose the framework of food to analyze Gandhi and his political activism? And what was that experience, just exploring all of that and writing that book?
I appreciate that question. It was a delightful and remarkably enjoyable experience working on that book. In fact, I think my wife would tell you, if you talk to her, that I perhaps might have enjoyed the writing of that book, the book about Gandhi's diet, more than any other project. And I think for a couple of reasons. I came to that project because I myself am quite fascinated by food, diet, nutrition, cooking. I love cooking. I love thinking about what I'm cooking. I love questions of nutrition. They're very important to me. So I had that interest. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this was actually one of Gandhi's great and abiding passions. One could argue, in fact, that it ranked on an equal footing with all of his other great passions and goals, that for him, questions of diet were of supreme importance, precisely because they were bound up with all these other questions. And that's how I ended up framing the book, is to look at how does studying Gandhi's diet allow us to understand not just the man and what he ate or didn't eat, but also to understand his views on politics, his views on religion. Every facet of his life can be understood through the lens of diet. Think about the Salt March. One of his most famous nonviolent campaigns is rooted in the importance of salt. And I was struck by this remarkable irony that on the one hand, Gandhi is championing greater access to salt, but on the other hand, for much of his life, he strove to dramatically limit salt in his own diet, going for years actually with what he called his saltless diet, which wasn't exactly saltless, but it was a diet without any added or additional salt. So he tried to survive solely on the salt that was already within the foods that he was eating. So he has his own deep and personal relationship with salt that I end up arguing is one of the driving forces in leading him to the idea of the Salt March. If he hadn't been so obsessed with salt on an individual level, I don't think he would have come to the idea of protesting the salt tax in the way that he did ultimately. That's one of the arguments of the book. There's chapters on his views on chocolate and sugar, on fasting, on farming, on Ayurveda and other kinds of medicinal dietary questions. And in each of these chapters, my goal was to both allow the reader to understand the complexity of Gandhi's relationship to food, which is itself fascinating, but also then to use that as a lens to look at other facets of Gandhi's life, so that hopefully when the reader finishes the book, they understand Gandhi better, they understand his diet better, and they understand every facet of his life better.
Right. Yeah, I think the whole idea that Gandhi's ideas of food, of course, the salt example is something which I was aware of, but his views on chocolate, those were just I had never heard of it. And you're very right that as soon as you're done reading the book, you get an idea of course, Gandhi the man, but also his sense of political activism and how all of that just sort of coalesced into a coherent narrative about whatever Gandhi was all about. I was reading this book by Tom Standage. It's called An Edible History of Humanity. And the whole book makes a very important point, of course, of talking about where did rice cultivation come from, or where did wheat cultivation come from, but also about food as an ideological weapon, where where collectivism in the ancient societies was so much premised on who has the access to food, that entire societies were sort of built around understanding how do you ration food and how can food be used as a tool of negotiations. So both of those ideas combine really well, and I'm glad you decided to look at Gandhi from the lens of food. And of course, it's always fun to read about food as an Indian.
As it should be. as it should be. Well, here's actually one thing I disagree with Gandhi about. He, as you know from reading the book, was very opposed to delicious food. He worried that it would, seduce him away from a focus on the more important things in life. But I don't go with him that far. I'll go some of the road with him, but at that point, I think he goes too far, at least for me.
Right, and I think that speaks to Gandhi's inherent asceticism.
It does, indeed.
Which is something you make sure that you put Kamala Devi on one side and Gandhi, and you mention that how the asceticism doesn't translate both ways. Kamala Devi is much more like a Tagore in that sense that she absolutely appreciates the aesthetic beauty of just beauty and taste, and she's not shy to sort of embrace that. But
that's exactly right.
I'm curious, when you got introduced to Kamala Devi, I was hearing a couple of your lectures and you mentioned Ram Guha, who is, by the way, one of my favorite historians, reached out to you in regards for the India Live series. You've already worked with Gandhi. Of course, people like Gandhi, Nehru, a lot more of their materials are available. So when you decided to collaborate with Ram Guha for this series, was Kamala Devi the obvious choice, or did you have any other Indian lives and you were trying to select between those 2 or 3 people?
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm delighted that you share my opinion of Ram Guha as a historian. He's one of my favorite historians as well. And he's been a tremendous mentor and supporter of my work ever since we met at what was then known as the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi. He was very kind to me when I was a young graduate student and has remained a great supporter ever since then. And when he reached out to ask about contributing a book to this series, he suggested Kamala Devi, but also raised a few other possibilities of other figures that I could potentially write upon. I think Ramanohar Lohia was another one, someone I've written about previously, and also find both heroic in his own way and fascinating. But it was a pretty easy choice for me because in all of the research I've done, starting with my initial dissertation, Kamala Devi has always been one of the most fascinating figures, and also one of the figures who I think is most understudied and not sufficiently well known. Now, of course, in India, I think she's much better known than in the US. But much of what she's known for in India is only one facet of her work. Her championing of arts and particularly handicrafts has guaranteed a certain kind of reputation within India that I think is well deserved. That was an incredibly important part of her work, especially in the second half of her life. But the broad impact of what she accomplished and the broad range of her intellectual engagement, she was a very prodigious writer and a remarkably interesting thinker that I don't think was well appreciated even within India. So I found it an exciting challenge to think about how I could do justice to someone like Kamala Devi, who really had engaged herself in almost all of the major social movements and struggles of her time, written extensively about them, traveled all around the world. I think her travels put her on par with any other major figure in the Indian independence struggle. Very few people traveled as much as she did, and she had a tremendously global vision of her effort. So it was an exciting project for me. It was daunting, of course, to figure out how to get such a rich and interesting and consequential life into the small confines of one book, and also challenging to do justice to her, given that I did have to do a lot more sleuthing work to find good sources. Writing about Gandhi is very easy because there's hundreds of other books about him. All of his papers have already been carefully gathered. It's a much harder thing in many ways to write about someone like Kamala Devi, who's there are some of her works gathered in the archives in Delhi, but a lot of her life had to be pieced together using other kinds of historical detective work. But that's part of what's fun about being a historian, is that you get to go out and try your best to find interesting and unusual sources. I think my favorite for that particular project actually were the police records. Kamala Devi was such a radical that the colonial authorities kept good track on her movements and efforts, and so I was able to use a lot of police records to better understand her involvement in a variety of movements, and then a lot of personal letters that she wrote to other people that give a more personal window on her life, both the political, public-facing part of her life and also the more private, personal parts of her life.
I think growing up in India, frankly, I had heard of Kamala Devi only as footnotes to something written on Nehru or something written on Gandhi. So I think I completely relate to your fact that even I was not for me, the introduction to Kamala Devi was really through your book, which is, why I'm doubly thankful that you decided to take on that challenge and write the whole book. So let's get a little deeper into the process of writing this book before we come back to, Ram Guha and all that.
Sure.
Kamala Devi existed in India during the times of some other fairly prominent females, right? There was Sarojini Naidu, who she was related with through a second marriage. Then there was Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. And as you mentioned, she is known for her arts, but her political activism or just her, her stature as a public intellectual is not that well known. Why do you think that is? Do you think there is some intentionality that the history books just relegated her to the archives? Was she not controversial enough? Why, or was it just happenstance that she never got the due that she deserved in larger public discourses?
It's a great question. I'd say there are at least two reasons that come immediately to mind. One is, of course, that there was for a long period and to some degree even now still remains a bias in the literature towards the accomplishments of men. And that's not just true for India. This is, was for, again, a long time a problem in every country in how history was told. In the United States, history was the works of great men, particularly white men. And really, until the middle of the 20th century, was that the sort of dominant narrative, and then it's sort of slowly been dismantled. But I think a lot of figures remain to be uncovered and respected, their history has remained shrouded just because they were women. I think that's part of the problem. But I also think part of the problem in the case of Kamala Devi was that she didn't have a official public-facing government role at the time of the transition to independence and in the years afterwards in the same way that some other figures did. And her own personal life, particularly her decision to divorce her husband, which was extremely controversial at that time, that decision alienated her from Sarojini Naidu, who was, as you know, the wife of her husband, the sister of her husband,
right?
And in the process also created a kind of a smear on Kamala Devi's reputation that hampered her political progress. Now, not for everyone. Nehru, for example, remains quite supportive of her. And Gandhi is at first distanced from her, but then ultimately the two, Kamala Devi and Gandhi, come back together and actually are very close at the time of partition. But I think that decision to divorce creates a cleavage and a sort of an obstacle to Kamala Devi's political progress that then ultimately has a lasting impact on her reputation. I think that plays a part in this story as well.
Right. So here's this person who clearly dons multiple hats, right? She's a connoisseur of the arts, extremely politically aware. She's traveled so well. She has that iconic Rosa Parks-like moment, which you describe in your book. Also, you mentioned in your one of your lectures, you mentioned this rather emotional angle of relatability that she was a single mother as well, and you grew up with a single mother as well. Of course, unlike Gandhi and Nehru, there's not as much epistolary evidence. There's not as many letters as these two guys have. How do you deal with this level of intersectionality with a historic person who doesn't have hundreds of books written for them. As a biographer, how challenging was this when you decided to start getting into the weeds of writing about Kamala Devi?
I appreciate the question. There were certain aspects of her life that were more challenging than others. Her private life, for example, is something that I was able to write into a little bit because there were some letters that offered some clues, because she had sat for a Hindi language biography of hers that came out when Kamala Devi was still alive, and that biography allowed a more intimate view into her thoughts on her private life than most other documents did. But it still remains the fact that we only have a relatively blinkered view on Kamala Devi's personal struggles, and she wanted it that way. And so as a historian, I kind of tried to walk a middle ground where on the one hand, I wanted to respect Kamala Devi's reticence and her own privacy. And on the other, I wanted to respect the imperative of sharing the truth. And so I tried to find a middle path on that one. There are other aspects of her life where I was able to find some really rich and enlightening sources. So as I mentioned, the police records were wonderful, especially during the times of the Salt Satyagraha when Kamala Devi was deeply involved, focused on the movement in Mumbai, then Bombay. So those records are incredibly rich. But also towards the end of her life, there were lots of records related to her activism and engagement with the arts that I found just a treasure trove of opportunities to look into how this woman who had lived so many different lives, so many different movements she had been part of, so much travel, how she approached aging with simultaneously a sort of fierce commitment to continuing to fight the good fight and to pursue the cause of justice, but also a deep awareness of her own a bodily frailty and the limitations that aging forces on one. She was very candid about that. So I think that this combination of sources, of sort of official government sources, letters and other things, including her writings. I mean, she published several books. She published lots and lots of articles. And that was a source that, I don't think had been nearly engaged upon enough earlier. As someone who is drawn in part to intellectual history, I wanted to do justice to the richness of her ideas. This whole mixture of different sources, I hope, allowed me to portray her in the fullness that she deserves.
Right. And talking about the fullness, Kamala Devi's fullness of ideas, so a lot of her ideas for the times she's living in are certainly pretty radical. They be that her personal ideas, then of course her personal life when she divorces and remarries and things like that. The whole idea around feminism. Now, Kamala Devi could very well be considered one of those proto-Indian feminists who essentially just exemplified the whole idea of feminism in India in the most clear-cut ways possible. However, she herself always shirked away from the title of being a feminist. What was that about? Like, why was she not embracing the title of being a feminist?
She saw it as a Western import that was needlessly divisive, and she wasn't alone in seeing the term feminist that way. Her sister-in-law, Sarojini Naidu, famously said, "I am not a feminist." There were other important Indian women activists who were fighting against sexism and patriarchy, but didn't want to be labeled feminists because they saw it as a Western idea, but I think even more importantly, they saw it as a divisive idea that would separate them off from the men that they were working with in order to confront a range of injustices in society. And this was always very important to Kamala Devi. She cared deeply about the struggle for women's liberation. She cared deeply about fighting against patriarchy and sexism. she experienced it herself in her own life as first a child widow, and then later as a divorced woman. She faced all sorts of hurdles and barriers, and so she felt this very deeply. But she also cared with equal passion for the struggle against colonialism, for the struggle against racism, for the struggle against class inequity. And she felt that all of these struggles were best fought in a united front in which women and men worked together across these divides. So her hesitancy or her opposition to the term feminist really comes from her desire to have an inclusive movement that would bring men and women together to fight against all of these different injustices.
So do you think could that also be a reason why, of course, she's against patriarchy and she's against sexism, she's embodying the ideals of feminism, but somewhere down the line, she's also slightly status quoist? Do you think that's why the present day feminists or the modern day activism hasn't really uptaken Kamala Devi as one of their icons?
Certainly, as she ages, her views become less radical in comparison to those of many of the younger activists, particularly feminist activists in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think some of this is just the power of seeing change over time and the impact that this has on one. So in the case of Kamala Devi, she is looking back from the late 60s and 70s on the struggles that she had to fight in the 20s and 30s. And from her vantage point, the women of India had made tremendous progress. And of course they had. And I think the challenge for anyone who is trying to create important change in the world is to simultaneously recognize the progress that has been made and also continue fighting to make more progress. And I think in her later years, at least on the question of gender equity, Kamala Devi tilted perhaps too much towards celebrating the gains that had been made rather than remaining focused on what still needed to be done. She was certainly criticized by younger feminists for doing that, and I think there were some grounds for that criticism. But I would say that there were also younger feminists that found her a heroic figure and a role model and a mentor, and especially in the global context, I think Kamala Devi's approach to what would later be called third world feminism, an approach to a kind of feminism that was bound up with national liberation struggles, that was bound up with this more intersectional approach, that was incredibly forward thinking. And my sense is that today there are many younger feminists out there, and I would consider myself a feminist as well, but there are people who are much more deeply engaged in that movement than I am, who care deeply about the kinds of intersectional approaches that Kamala Devi embodied and advanced, right? Who care deeply about constructing a movement that is fighting against sexism and patriarchy, but also fighting against racism, also fighting against class inequity. And that, I think, is where Kamala Devi's example remains still most relevant in our world today.
Right. And when you were saying this, I couldn't help but draw some parallels between Kamala Devi and Gandhi. Of course, the other, I mean, any story about the Indian freedom struggle has to have Gandhi at its center. But the way Kamala Devi's ideas of feminism sort of evolved and they were within a certain parent structure, I feel Gandhi's ideas about the caste system evolved, where he's anti-untouchability, but he still has some intellectual reasoning for why the Varnashram should exist. Unlike Ambedkar, who wants to just do away with this whole structure. How was as you've mentioned, the relationship between Kamala Devi and Gandhi, much like perhaps Nehru and Gandhi, there is respect, but there's not blind devotion.
That's true.
Is Kamala Devi one of those outlier female figures in the freedom struggle who's not completely prostrating in front of Gandhi?
She certainly was, as you said, someone who was respectful towards Gandhi, who learned a lot from him, and one might even argue she was one of his most committed disciples, at least in the sense that she was deeply committed to an approach to social change that was grounded in the work of one's own hands. You know, and Gandhi's passion for the charkha, the spinning wheel, and his belief in a sort of grassroots-led approach to rural development is one that Kamaladevi took on and advanced at a time when the prevailing winds were blowing more with a sort of top-down, big industry approach to development. So there's a way in which she's certainly extremely Gandhian, but there are also many ways in which she's not. We mentioned much earlier in the conversation her rejection of asceticism, her love for pleasures of different kinds. That's certainly un-Gandhian, and she challenges Gandhi. One of my favorite moments in the book is when she just joins the Salt March and directly challenges Gandhi to expand its participants to include women. So she challenges him, and there are times when he, I think, is put off by this, and when he sees her as too rebellious. And as I said earlier, his initial response to her divorce is one of caution and concern. But ultimately, to his credit, I think he respects her as well and comes to see her as an important figure who is embodying some of the values that the two of them shared. So they're able to find their way forward. I think on some issues or topics, neither of them evolves as far as I, as a historian, would have liked to see them go. Caste is actually the best example of this. Kamaladevi's views on caste are very much in line with the other Congress socialists that she was connected to, and that she saw untouchability as an evil. She wanted to end caste actually more broadly. But she didn't prioritize it because she thought that it would kind of naturally pass away when the extremes of class were dealt with first. So she had a kind of classically Marxist approach to issues of caste, which I think was a blind spot in her case. And it, although it was different for Gandhi, I think he was also, in his own way, overly optimistic about the way in which other movements would, do away with the extremes of caste. But on many other issues, they come together in really advancing causes that were well beyond their time, or at least within the movement. So, Kamaladevi is one of the most passionate anti-racists within the Indian freedom struggle. And this is something, Gandhi, as you know, is still to this day often accused of being a racist because of comments he made during his early days in South Africa. But he really evolves on that question. And I think in part because of the influence of people like Kamaladevi, who help him see that he needs to discard this older view of race and embrace one that's really explicitly anti-racist, and that sees the struggle against empire as bound up with this larger struggle of people against racism throughout the world. So I think that's one of the ways in which the two figures come together in a more positive direction.
Right. And right after Gandhi, the person literally and quite figuratively as well, who sort of got in command was Nehru. Now, Nehru is this extremely Cambridge educated elite. Now, some people think he was rather deracinated. I don't think that. But what was the relationship between Kamaladevi and Nehru? Were they more on, was there more overlap, given both of them had a much more global outlook than perhaps Gandhi, who decided to look inwards, particularly within the Indian Indian classical structure of family, society, etc.?
Kamaladevi has a very rich and complicated relationship to Nehru. I wouldn't say there's more overlap than Gandhi, but I would say there's a different kinds of overlap. So Nehru, of course, as you know, is a much more drawn towards socialism. And that's something that he and Kamaladevi share. Even though after independence, of course, Nehru remains with the Congress, and Kamaladevi contests an election as a candidate for the Socialist Party. So they're politically speaking, their narrow allegiances don't always overlap, but in terms of their general philosophy of political economy, they're both socialists in a way that Gandhi is not. On the other end, and you mentioned the global travel, that I think is another key connection. Nehru was always thinking about things in an international and global light, and so is Kamaladevi, and they had a very similar view of the world, one in which India's independence was bound up with the freedom of other colonized peoples, not just in Asia, but also in Africa. One in which both hoped for a world of independent states, but that were, linked to each other in various forms of friendship and solidarity. So that's also a connection. But then, in other facets, when it comes, for example, to Gandhi's emphasis on the work of the hands, I think, that's something Kamaladevi is much quicker to take up and advance than Nehru was. He's supportive, of course. He's actually one of her most important champions when she's so committed to handiworks and handicrafts. He sees the value of it, but it's not at the center of his vision of development in the same way that it was for Kamaladevi or Gandhi.
Right. You mentioned how Kamaladevi at one point she attests to the charisma of Nehru, which is I think those bits here and there really helped develop this very, as you mentioned, as a very full picture of Kamaladevi. Yeah. As a historian, so let's go back to the mechanics of writing this book or writing any book. When I read your books, when I read your book on Gandhi, when I read your book on Kamaladevi, as someone who's never taken any social science class in his life, I can still not only follow through, but glean a lot of important insights, and the whole experience is pretty illuminating for me. A lot of times when academics write, they write for other academics, and it's not something which regular people might really enjoy picking up. So for you, are you naturally a great writer who can write for a general audience, or do you employ very different muscles when you're writing a paper to be presented in a historical conference versus writing a book which would be published for mass consumption?
Well, you flatter me, and I am honored to be flattered. I think someone like a Ram Guha is a great example of someone who's able to write books that are both academically rigorous and intellectually complex, but also deeply accessible. And I've always tried to do the same, but I wouldn't say that it's a special strength of mine. I think it's something I have to really work at and work toward. I think academics too often write just for other small groups of academics, and there's an important part of that. As a scholar, it's important to be able to share one's work with one's colleagues in a way that you can try to get at the heart of things in the most complex and rigorous fashion. But I also think, especially for historians, one of the great joys of being a historian is that people are interested in what we have to say, and we can share it with them in ways that are accessible. Ultimately, we are storytellers, and stories are very powerful things that have meaning in our world. And I do hope that I can tell stories and share the past in ways that will have meaning for people, that will touch them in their own lives, will help shape the way they think about the world we live in today. And ultimately, that I think is part of the power and beauty of history, is that it's not just about the past. It's also about where we are now and where we want to go. And especially if, like me, you're studying people who are so deeply committed to fighting for a better world, I think we owe it to those people to find ways to engage their legacy and bring it into our own lives today.
Wonderful. When I was listening to, I think, the lecture both of you gave at the Bangalore International Center, where Ram Guha very correctly described the book as the triumph of the biographer's art. So I was curious, as a historian, how different is writing a book on history versus writing a biography? Like, are those two very different genres, or are those just very similar undertakings?
They're very different genres, and I like both, but they have different challenges and different opportunities. I'd say with a biography, one of the challenges, but also opportunities, is that you have to decide how much weight to give to different parts of a person's life. If I'm writing a book, well, right now I'm writing a book about the American Civil Rights Movement. I'm not required to write about every region that the movement existed in or every facet of that movement, because I can say, well, I'm focusing on this particular dimension of the movement. But if you write a biography and you say, well, I'm just going to focus on Kamaladevi's, work in the women's movement, for example, or I'm only going to focus on Kamaladevi's interaction with handicrafts, that'd be fine. I mean, it's okay to do that, but it's also a very different kind of biography. And many people, I think, when they come to read a biography, they want to, I mean, for good reason, they want to get a sense for the full sweep of someone's life. They want to understand, where did this person's family come from? What was their childhood like? And then take the story all the way through to how did they age and what was their ultimate legacy. And that's a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity as a historian to try to do justice to the fullness and richness of a human life.
And specifically for when you're writing a biography, I would presume that as a historian with modern day sensibilities, there might be a instinct to project modern day sensibilities onto the person you're writing about and probably judge them inadvertently, even if it's not conscious. Did you have any of those moments when you were writing this book, and which you had to, like, in a very disciplined, regimented way, stop yourself from doing?
I appreciate that question. As a writer, I think one has to be aware of one's own grounding in the world, where one is writing from. And that can be a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity. And I think the challenge is that you don't want to bring your own worldview into a text in a way that it either silences the voices of those you're writing about or judges them in ways that are unfair. On the other hand, it would be, I think, a mistake to suppose that one could write a good book that doesn't engage with where we are now and doesn't engage with the questions and issues that the author is grappling with. So in the case of Kamaladevi, I mentioned earlier my criticism of her limitations in regard to issues of caste. Now, that's something that I talk about in the book. I state explicitly, but I also don't let it dominate the book, because that, I think, would be a disservice to her. So you have to find a middle ground where you say, okay, from my vantage point in 2024 or 2025, writing from the position I'm in now, it seems to me that this person could have evolved further in their views on this topic or that topic. Right. But the more important, I think, goal for a historian is to try to understand where the person came to, how they viewed things and what shaped how they viewed things. So it's not so much about judging them as much as about understanding them and understanding what motivated them to approach life in the way that they did. But ultimately, I think as a biographer, your job isn't to judge. Your job is to understand and to share. And especially, with someone like Kamaladevi, that's pretty easy because I am, I'm a big fan of her. I think she was an amazing human being. Now, that's a challenge in and of itself. Right. Right. Because you don't want to romanticize or glorify someone's life. You don't want to oversimplify it. You don't want to shy away from the more difficult parts of it. Because then ultimately you're not writing a biography of a person, you're writing a biography of a saint or, and that's not something I'm interested in. So there's I think a very healthy middle ground there where you recognize someone's foibles, their complexities, and actually bring those into the narrative in a way that helps us empathize with them as a human being, and see the fullness of who they were.
Right. So I think that makes a complete sense, that a biography is it's neither a hagiography, neither is it a work of polemics. So you've got to just stick that middle ground. Dr. Slate, I could talk to you for hours, but since time is of the essence, let me just get back to my 3 last questions. you, having studied the Indian anti-imperial movement, now you mentioned you're writing a book on the American civil rights movement, of course, the anti-racist movements, and having read all of these exemplars like Gandhi, Nehru, Du Bois, Carver, what lessons do you think all of these historical struggles and historical crusaders of justice, for lack of a better word, could offer modern contemporary social justice movements around race, around environment, since you are
Sure.
and it is going through a pretty bad environmental crisis right now. What do you think are those lessons we can glean out of these struggles?
I'll give you just two. There, I think there are many, but the two that come immediately to mind are, first, that all of us have a role to play, that we can't just wait around for famous leaders to take charge and lead us to victory, that all of these movements are involving thousands and thousands of people, many of whom will never be remembered by historians. And that's part of our responsibility, is to find ways to get involved and to fight for the things that we believe in. That's the first point. And then the second point is to try to remain open and inclusive when we think about what we care about and when we think about other movements. So if I'm really passionate about the environment, which in fact I am, great, fight for that, but don't ignore struggles against racism or struggles against caste or struggles against religious discrimination. So if I think one of the key lessons I take from Kamala Devi's life is the importance of continually reconsidering the limits of what we care about and thinking about how we can support those who are fighting for causes that maybe this isn't my primary cause. Maybe it's not my most deeply held beliefs, but I still think it's important, and I want to find ways to be in solidarity and be supportive of those other struggles as well.
Wonderful. But right at the starting, you mentioned that somewhere in the middle, in fact, you mentioned that you are working on a new project on the American civil rights movement. So within limits of whatever it is that you can tell us, and without giving too much away, what can readers expect from you in the future?
Yes. This is a difficult question to be succinct on because I'm so deeply enmeshed in this current research. It's a book about the Highlander Folk School, which was a remarkable institution, one of the few integrated schools in the American South during the days of Jim Crow segregation, and a very important training center for civil rights activists. Every major civil rights activist went through Highlander at one point or another, and it had a huge impact on many of them. And as a blessing for historians, Highlander was very interested in recording its workshops. So there's hundreds of hours of audio and video recordings of these civil rights workshops. I'm using those as my main archival base in order to tell what I hope will be a new and enlightening history of the civil rights movement.
Wonderful. I'm about to go and watch the Nickel Boys, which is also set up in the school where kids are segregated in the Jim Crow era. So I'm extremely looking forward to reading when you come out with this book, and then we'll do a much longer episode. But I think, so the last question, which is like a tradition on the show, for me and my readers, recommend books, music, movies, which have meant a lot to you. From your out of office email, I know you're big into music, because that sitar piece and that guitar piece is amazing. Something which I'm totally planning to steal for my own out of office email. But so tell us your recommendations about books or movies which really meant a lot to you last year, or they've just meant a lot to you all your life.
Okay. All right. Well, I was just having a conversation with someone about the book that I've long considered to be my personal favorite. It's always a bit arbitrary, I'm sure you know, to decide on such things, because there's so many books that have touched me and that I love. But there is one that I have reread many times that I just adore, and that many, at least in this country, many people are not familiar with. It's called The Master and Margarita. It's a Russian novel by Mikhail Bulgakov, and it's just so captivating and compelling. So that's usually my favorite books. The first two are Russian. I love the Brothers Karamazov as well. That's another book that I reread. And then Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace is another of my favorite books that I would recommend to anyone. Movies, goodness gracious. So there's an old classic called The King of Hearts, which is was for a long time one of my the sort of the film that I would rank as my favorite, but it's shifted around a lot. I think these days, actually, an Indian film, Satyajit Ray's Mahanagar.
Masterpiece.
Yeah. I teach that film regularly, and I love it. Every time I teach it, it just captivates me. So that's certainly high up on the list. Music. Goodness great. This is one of the things I love about Kamala Devi, is that she was very aware of just the incredible richness and vast beauty of culture in our world. There's so much amazing music out there. I am a fan of the sitar. I like many different facets of Indian classical music, both in the sort of it comes back to a question of food, both the northern and southern traditions.
Right.
There's so much richness there. Maybe just to throw another random one out there, I'm a huge fan of John Coltrane, saxophone. And Coltrane had his own interest in India. This goes back to the linkages between African Americans and the U.S. Jazz is another really rich and interesting dimension of connection between India and the United States. And the John Coltrane and his wife were both very engaged with Indian culture and very interested in forging linkages that way. So anyway, John Coltrane, and the album Lush Life has always been my favorite John Coltrane album. If listeners are interested in one to start with, I'd recommend Lush Life.
Wonderful. No, I think I'll be linking all of these in the show notes below so that listeners can just dive into rabbit holes as they wish. But this has been extremely illuminating, Dr. Slate. Thank you so much for your time. I know we took about 46 odd minutes of your research for your new book. So I will let you get to it. And again, whenever the new book is out, we will do a longer episode, hopefully in person, hopefully, soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you.